I'm Dolen Perkins-Valdez, and I'm a historical fiction writer. When I'm not writing, I'm teaching. When I'm not teaching, I'm playing with my kids. But the place I love to be the most is in the library. I love to read historical fiction. It just transports me. So I decided to start this book club. Here together, we will read stories featuring women's histories. We'll talk to writers, we'll have discussions. It'll be fun. Come on and join us. Hi, Denny.
Hello, Dolen. How you doing this evening?
I'm good. I was thinking as we were, preparing for tonight, I was thinking of that day you and I had lunch together. Do you remember
Yeah,
that?
oh, I do. I do. When I was still living in the wonderful town of DC, because now I'm in Savannah, Georgia.
I saw that.
Yeah, and I got back in my home after some upheaval, but it wasn't as dramatic as some other places in the state. So I did okay.
Yeah,
Uh,
you were saying your power was out,
My
everything's
power's out for about a day. But so many other places in the state of Georgia and Florida and other places impacted by the hurricane had a much harder time. So I did okay in comparison to the rest of the world in the state
yes.
this year, Hurricane Helene.
Yeah.
So
Well,
I'm
I'm glad
good.
you're okay and your power's back on and
Back operational,
yeah.
trying to get things done. But
Mhm.
yes, I remember our lunch. It was very kind of you. This is going back a few years when we had lunch in DC. I don't even think I wasn't published yet, and I was just checking in because I said, "Oh, she's right here in the state," and I think I just reached out to you, and you were gracious enough to say, "Yeah, come on down." So we got to talk about books and things like that, and it was good.
And then you blew up.
Yeah, let's not talk about blowing up stories because there's a lot going on there. But yeah, I got in the world of publishing and have had it's a hard um, road, but at the same time incredibly rewarding. And I'm in the midst of trying to finish a book I've been working on for what seems like forever, but every book has its own personality, its own challenges, its own thing that keeps you at night or it just puts you in a coma. One of the two.
Mhm. Well, let's hear about the writing of this book, The Trial
Uh,
of Mrs. Rhinelander.
yes. Yeah.
I want to know everything, Denny, because I had never heard of this trial.
Okay.
And I know you are an impeccable researcher. And this is, I mean, this is what I love about good historical fiction writers. I can trust that you have done the work. I mean, I know that you took some imaginative
Oh,
liberties,
absolutely. Absolutely.
but
Yeah.
this trial was real.
This trial was real. A lot of I incorporated headlines from actual newspaper articles into the book. But let me go back because the book was frankly suggested to me by my first editor at Kensington, S.E. Soga, because I had never heard of the story either. So I started, collecting history about that time period as I was writing my other novels. And what surprised me and challenged me as a historical fiction writer was how much information was available. That was one of the times, in comparison to the other book I wrote, The Other Princess, there was a lot of actual factual information, but this had trial transcripts. It had dissertations because it became a topic of study in terms of racial relationships. I mean, this news story took place, the trial of Mrs. Rhinelander took place in the 1920s. It kicked off in the 1920s. That was a time period where the New York Times or the Daily News or any of these newspapers in not only in New York but across the country were covering news. and news was sensational. Everything. And this is also a time where you might recall in Chicago was Leopold and Loeb, the two young men who killed a young boy just to see if they were very wealthy, and that became headline news. Then you also had the Stokes monkey trial. That was headline news. So this story about the Rhinelanders became one of those sensational national news stories. But my approach, there was so much information that as I went through the research, I wanted to make sure I told her story, not the lawyer's story, not too much diving deep into the money story, even though it is pivotal throughout this situation. So I had to make some choices. One of the things that just resonated with me about the real Alice Beatrice Jones was a love story that really took me a while to get to that perspective, if you will, as to where, like, where are you going to take that story? How are you going to dive into that story? So there was the love story, but there was also the conflict of her family that had much going on. So yeah, research was definitely enjoyable, a challenge, and for one of the few times in my process, I felt a little overwhelmed by all of the information that was available.
Well, I love the frame that you created of this, well, really Alice's niece,
Yes.
right? Interviewing her to find out what happened in her family,
Yeah.
and Alice being ready to talk to her and to clear up some of the confusion.
Slowly but surely, she was ready. Yeah.
Well, she
And
let her come over there. She didn't, she didn't let.
use it. That's right. It's very true.
Mhm.
And some of those things, like her niece, an actual person, however, not necessarily the actual person that I wrote about in her 20s, but she was definitely a part of the family. Her eldest sister, she was her eldest sister's daughter. So that frame also helped me find the conflict in the story and allowed the character, I believe, to arc, to show the contrast between where she was in her life, where she went, and did she really change from the young woman who fell in love in 1921 and the woman involved in more legal conflict in 1940s, because that part of the story is also taken from the headlines, if you will.
So Alice Jones Rhinelander believed this isn't really a passing story per se.
No, it's not. No.
She believed that she was white.
Yes. She was raised, and her family immigrants from Britain, and the British structure on color and colorism different at that time. They did not have the one drop rule in Britain. They definitely had racial structure and prejudices and racism and what have you, but it was still a Jamaican who might be they had terminology like mulatto, coloreds, Creole, Negro. There was just a whole, if you will, rainbow of how to describe and how you fit into the society during that time period. And it was sometimes based on shade of skin as well. So that family, when they came to America, were in the census, I found their original census information, were all white. And that's the way they were filled out until after time, some things changed.
Well,
So,
the most devastating line is at the end of one of the chapters where she says to her mother in anger, "We stopped being white the day we got off that ship from England."
yeah, yeah. And that was a cultural shock. The mother was very dominant in what I mean, she was a white woman,
She
number
was,
one,
right.
and she raised her children and in a community that accepted them as white, as long as every now and then when daddy came in to the picture, there might be some pushback, but not much. He owned his own building. He owned his own cab company that started with maybe one or two cabs, but it was a business that grew. So there were many things about the family that didn't fit the mold of what you might consider, well, definitely didn't fit the mold of the Negro family opportunities and what have you, unless you were in Harlem in that environment where opportunities allowed that. And I am hoping, I keep feeling like I'm about to sneeze. So if I,
Okay, it's okay. I mean, I'm so fascinated by it. Let me ask you, so I felt like she was sort of complicated and realistic for that time. I know
yeah,
contemporary readers probably want her to be different than what she was,
yes,
but
I,
um,
mhm,
but
yeah,
when you look through all of those records,
mhm.
what was your sense of her as a person? Did you get, I mean, because at some point it changed from her trying to salvage the marriage to her wanting money.
To me, her motivation consistently was not to lose her husband.
Okay.
And what ended up happening is bitterness and surprises that she did not expect, that they may not have expected. And so, as is the case, I think, with any relationship that is going in the wrong direction, um, there's always someone who's trying to hang on to the threads of that love affair. And she was the one who was trying to hang on to it.
What about him?
My opinion of him was that he was young. He was 5 years younger than her.
Oh.
Yeah, he was 18. She was 22, maybe 4
Oh,
years.
yeah, I remember that. Okay, yeah.
And he was also treated as less by his family. I mean, he was a stutterer. He was someone who was not placed on the same pedestal as the other members of the family.
Mhm.
So he still had he had those problems, those challenges within his own family. So he felt accepted. But at the same time, there's also the 400, the society group that have had an immense amount of power and influence and heritage and lineage and all of this stuff that goes with his family came to New York as part of the Huguenots in the 1600s or something like that. They beat the Mayflower or fought to get there, who was there first.
Mhm.
And so with all of that, he couldn't give up that. And he wouldn't give up that, it became love or money or heritage or, what are you willing to sacrifice for love became his question. So I felt he loved her, but that's with an asterisk,
Mhm.
you know?
Mhm.
So it was a challenging book to write because there was so many directions you could have taken the story. There's so many different perspectives out there on this whole situation that transpired. Especially when you read dissertations that were written or thesis written back in the 40s or the 50s or the 60s, and the changing attitude that reflects the decade that that particular story was written. So I had to keep those things in mind. And as you know, as a historical fiction author, you don't just look at your story that you're writing. You look at how people were making money, who were the political people in power, in control, what was the environment of that world that had an impact on the story you want to tell. Because you don't write historical fiction in a vacuum. There's a world that impacts the people that you're writing about.
Mm.
So,
Wow, that is so fascinating. And are there any Rhinelander descendants?
I didn't look too hard because just,
I know that feeling.
okay. Yeah.
But he never had children that we know of.
No, we don't know if she ever had children.
What about
Oh no, he never married.
he never married, and
No.
she never married again.
And she lived until she was 90.
She lived until she was 90.
Yep. And one of the
Did she live as a white woman?
No, she stopped. Yeah.
She stopped living as a white woman.
Yes, she did. Yes, she did. Her census, and the reason I say that with such confidence is once again, I looked at the census, and after 1930, I believe, she put Negro as her ethnicity, as her race, excuse me.
Wow.
You know. Complicated story. But at the same time, very human, a very human story. That it's sort of like the newspapers of that generation were TMZ. And I mean, literally stories where these reporters were hiding in bushes. You know, we laugh about some of these things because it's like, oh no, they were doing that back then too. And chasing her everywhere she went. And then there was again that Rhinelander family issue that really steps up in the 1940s. That was also stunning to me, that they wouldn't let go, wouldn't let go of their pride, paying her after I think it was the colonel, was Philip Rhinelander, the father. After he passed, the remaining sibling, she was like, no, we're not paying you any more money. And that was part of the front story, the 1940s story, that court battle, that pursuit. Interesting.
Alice was no joke. Okay, y'all, put your questions in the chat for Denny Bryce, and I know that she would be happy to hear from you. People are checking in from Oregon, Long Island, Atlanta. Dana says, I learned so much from this book and loved the accuracy.
Oh, thank you.
On Instagram, someone asked if she was passing, and the answer to that question, Denny said, is no, because she believed she was white. When they were in England, they lived as white people. The father, I know some of y'all haven't read the book, but the father was from
Jamaica,
and he was a lightly melanated person. I guess we can say, right? Lightly melanated. But he lived as a white man in England because the distinction there was not the one drop rule. And so people suspected he had a little something, like they thought he was a Spaniard and things like that. But he lived as a white man. But when the family came here, things started to happen, right?
Yeah, I don't want to give away too much, but one thing set the family, even before the stuff that happened with Alice, her eldest sister, Emily, really got into some interesting situations as well. So very complicated family. I would have wanted, I should if there are questions, you know, I would have loved to have more information about Alice in her later life.
Mhm.
Because there was, as so often happens, and when you have a historical figure that happens to be female, especially a woman of color or Black woman, or in America, you lose track of their lives after their moment in the spotlight, so to speak. And that's too bad. You want to dig deeper. You want to have more. I always want more. Even though this one gave me a lot, I wanted more.
Okay, well, that question was from my friend Kevin Worthy from Memphis. Thank you, Kevin, for the question. Trying to see if there are any other questions in Facebook. Dana wanted to know if you were specifically looking for a story like this or you just happened to find it. And Denny said that her editor gave her this. But Denny, speak a little more generally about how we as historical fiction writers, because I know you also wrote The Other Princess. Can you just tell them a little bit about, because The Other Princess is another fascinating nugget from history.
It's,
So
yeah. The Other Princess is the story of Queen Victoria's African goddaughter. Her name originally was Anya, and she was a princess in a West African tribe in West Africa, which is now Nigeria. But what happened back in the 1840s was that there were tribal wars, and enslavement was a part of what was happening between these tribes. And her family was murdered, and she was taken a few years later. She's a kid, 5 or 6, 7 years old. A few years later, she is, I want to say, rescued by a British officer who cuts a deal with the king of the Dahomey, King Gizo, and to take her as and again, in quotes, gift to Queen Victoria. And this is really her story of her exposure and life as part of the Queen's court, and her life not as part of the Queen's court. And it tends to go back and forth. Lots of travel between England, Sierra Leone, West Africa, a lot of interesting stops. A young woman who was very talented, a brilliant mind, a linguist. She spoke several dialects. She learned English on a boat ride from Africa to England. And she had a lot of amazing, fascinating experiences. And it was just a pleasure to research her because of there were letters that she wrote that gave me such a clear sense, at least in my mind, of her personality, her stubbornness, her ego, her survival instincts.
where did you find those letters, Denny? Were they in the archives in England or?
Actually, I dug them up online through some library work, but also I must give credit to a gentleman by the late Walter. I had the books in the other room, but his first name is Walter. He's a African American writer of YA. Back in the 90s, he wrote a book called At Her Majesty's Command.
Walter Myers?
Walter Myers, thank you so much. And the story goes that a bookshop in London who knew of his love of old things gave him a call and said, I have all this stuff that I found buried in a corner. And he went to London and grabbed it all. And it was letters, diaries, all of these things written by Sarah Forbes Bonetta. So I was able to, definitely his book, but going back and finding some stories and articles and historical accounts. In addition, her daughter, um, who was an actual goddaughter of Queen Victoria, her name was Victoria Matilda Randall, she wrote letters that recounted her the stories her mother told her.
Mother had told her.
About
Wow.
her childhood and some of the other things that happened. So not only being able to read her actual words, but also her daughter's perspective. And then there, Queen Victoria, who wrote millions of words in her diaries. I did not read all of her diaries, but I did find some resources that were able to point me to a few things here and a few things there that she actually wrote about. One of the things,
I'll try to interrupt. We have lots of questions coming in about the Rhinelander story, so I don't want to. I could ask you all day about that princess. Okay, real quickly.
Okay.
Someone says that they found pictures from the trial online.
Yes.
And wanted to know if those are the same Rhinelanders who built the mansion at 72nd and Madison in New
I
York.
think it's called the Rhinelander House, Princeville. There is a house in that area. I'm not sure right now. If you'd asked me 6 months ago when I was working on it, I'd know the address. But yes, there was Phillips, the Rhinelander House.
It's still there.
I think it's pretty much still there.
Wow.
Yeah.
So they were really wealthy. They said they read your book, Can't We Be Friends, and wondering how you and Eliza divided up the writing.
Well, wow. Eliza and I started that process in 2019. And what we did was we used to write together because we lived in the same town back then, and we just get together for write-ins. And the way we initially approached the story was many of the things I've already said about any story that I write in the historical world. We really checked out what was the attitude towards women in the 1950s, what was the attitude and in Hollywood, in the jazz scene, in the African American community, etc. And then we created a huge outline that Eliza put on Google Docs. She is the queen of Google Docs. And then we just fed into it and made decisions on how we were going to approach different parts of the story. I'd write a few chapters, send it to Eliza. She'd send me what she wrote. We'd write chapters together because we wanted a consistency with voices throughout the story. We wanted the flow to be as effective and as natural and as organic as possible. So it's a lot of, you write that part, you write that part, let's exchange it, you fix it, and let's go from there.
Awesome.
People, so I hope that answers the
question. Writing. Yolanda once said, I was really intrigued by the sister story. Did she really claim to be a Negro and divorce her husband over Alice's situation? I think she's talking about Roberta's mother.
Yes. I'll tell you which parts of the story I know are true. Because again, there's not a lot about the sister. Most definitely, she married a black man. She married a Negro man. And in order to, I did read someplace that in order to make sure there was no conflict, she said she was Negro. And her father kicked her out. All of that is true. But after she had her child, they started connecting. I have some of what I took some creative license regarding their relationship. I know that the youngest sister was married at least 2 or 3 times. And she, as far as I could find out, she never married anyone who wasn't white. So it's different choices by different sisters as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, another question is, What scene would you say, this is from Dana, was the most difficult or meaningful for you to work on emotionally?
The hardest scene in the book is the scene in the judge's chamber where she is asked to prove that he should have been able to tell that she was Negro.
And did that really happen?
Yes. I know, it's like, wow, okay.
That was a difficult scene to read. I'm sure it was difficult.
And I have a not really a funny story, but a real story. When I sent in the copy to my editor, um, somehow that scene was not in the book. I'd written it, but it was almost like I had a like a blackout, and it wasn't there. And she said,
You had sent a draft that didn't have it in that particular draft?
uh-huh. Yeah, yeah. And so she said, my editor is like, we talked about this scene, Denny. Where is it? And I said, I wrote it. Oh, I wrote it over there. I wrote it someplace else. And, because I am not a linear writer. I write in a bunch of different programs, and scenes are all over the place. But yeah, I had to add it back in. I was like, whoops. And I think that was somewhat psychological, I could not imagine it. It was a rough scene to write, but it definitely a real moment for that woman that was rough to read about.
Mm-hmm. April wanted to know if all your books are standalone, or do you have any series?
I don't have any series. They are all standalone, but I do tend to do something called Easter eggs, I think. Sometimes, at least when what I'm doing, I'm working on a book right now, and it's just full of little things that just make sense to me. So I put them in there, and I know they sort of are like a homage, if you will, to one of my earlier books, to a couple of my earlier books, but primarily.
I heard that term, Easter eggs. I like that.
I think it's called an Easter. Well,
for the real fans.
Real fans. I think that's from my fan fiction days, where I was like, oh, leave an Easter egg in the story.
Cheryl asks, what was your life revelation, if any, that you got from the story when all was said and done? Woo, powerful question.
Yeah. Actually, talking to Victoria Christopher Murray, who read it and was and did the cover quote, and we were talking about the book, and I think she enlightened me on something that I couldn't articulate at the time, but it has to do with labels and who has control of your this person or that person, you're Negro, you're colored, you're white, you're an immigrant, all of these terms that are how people are positioned in life, especially in that time period. If those terms did not exist, would that put more people on equal footing, whether money was involved or not? What if she wasn't this, that, or the other, and he wasn't this, that, or the other? Would that relationship have been different without all of those external factors? I guess I'm answering the question, but it felt like as I was writing it, I was like, wow, these folks didn't have a chance in America because of labels dictated who they were and who they could be with.
Labels are powerful.
Mm-hmm. Right? Yeah.
The lesson there. Okay, we're nearing the end. I'm trying to see if I've missed any questions from any of our readers. anybody have a final question? Um, Elizabeth wondered about the friendship she had with the journalist Marvel, I think Elizabeth is asking about. Was that true?
That was a creative license, but the reason it existed was because of a actual reporter named Marvel Cook. Marvel Cook was the first African American reporter at the New Amsterdam News. She was also a civil rights activist and a pivotal female journalist in her time. And she fought to cover the real stories. So Marvel was inspired. Marvel Cunningham, I believe, was that character's name in the trial of Mrs. Rhinelander, as well as some of her Rebecca's. Is Rebecca? What was her name? Yeah, say it again. So many people in my
I know that feeling. Once we exit the novel world and move on to the next one, it's like our mind, you have all those pages in your head, and then your mind has to let them go. So another
it
book.
has to let them go. And especially names. That's where I get stuck because I spend a lot of time on names. Rebecca, her name was Rebecca, I think. But anyway, I'm looking at the back of the book. Roberta, not Rebecca, Roberta, excuse me. But anyhow, yeah, it was definitely I lost track of the question, to be quite honest, because I was like, what was her name?
That's okay. We're having a good time, y'all. We have had a wonderful chat with Denny, and I love this book so much. I'm just going to hold it up again for those of you, The Trial of Mrs. Lander. Look at that cover, y'all. I'm trying to make it close so you can
Yeah.
see. Really beautiful.
I've had some lovely covers. I must admit, I'm very excited about the covers that I've had from both Kensington and William Morrow. Some great cover artists.
And can you tell us quickly, you said you're working on a new book now.
Yes, I am. I don't know when it's coming out, but I do know that once I get it in, there's a chance it will come out. It's called Where the False Gods Dwell. It's I have 3 POVs, and it has what I call it historical fiction, mystery, thriller, light. It's the story of 3 women, very different, who are traveling on parallel paths, and then their paths cross. And it takes place in 1935, starts in Chicago, spends some time on a ship called the SS Talamanca on their way to Kingston, Jamaica, and eventually they end up in a place called Cockpit Country, and that's where the maroon village of Akampong is located. And this book was inspired in part, even though it's not about her, by Catherine Dunham, who was a dancer.
Yeah.
In the 1930s, she was also an anthropology student and an anthropologist, and was given a few grants to travel to the Caribbean islands, Jamaica, Haiti, and some other places, St. Kitts, to study African dance. She had studied extensively in this country with Martha Graham's of the world, Ruth Page in Chicago, etc. And so I used that as a sort of a stepping stone for a story about some folks in Chicago who end up in Kingston with some other folks. And
wow, that sounds really good.
it's fun. I hope to finish it in this week. I don't know.
This week?
Yeah, I've been working on it for a minute.
Okay.
So yeah, it's and I have another book to work on after that, but it's not a biographical historical fiction, which my last 3 books have been. It's definitely takes from historical accounts, everything from what was happening in America, Depression, 1935, to the labor union movement in Jamaica against the sugar plantations and the banana plantations in the 1930s as well. So
Well,
we'll
we are
take.
yes, and that sounds so good. I can't wait. I can't wait to read it, and I want to just thank you, Denny, for joining us tonight. The book is
And
The
thank
Trial
you for
of Mrs.
inviting me.
Ryan.
I appreciate it.
What's that? Oh, picking you. Of course. Ever since that lunch,
Yeah.
I've been watching you rise, and I'm so thrilled for you and all your successes. And I want to highly recommend this book, y'all. I couldn't put it down. Okay. That's the only book I like these days. There's too much going on for me to slog through. I read this book in 2 days. I
Oh.
literally checked out of my life so I could see what was going to happen with Alice Jones Rhinelander. Fascinating character,
Thank you.
fascinating story. Thank you, Denny.
Thank you.